The night had already set in by the time I arrived at the scene. The air was thick with unease as the storm overhead rumbled ominously. It was my 15th year on the force, but even after all these years, the unsettling anticipation of stepping onto a fresh crime scene never ceased. The old mansion sat atop a hill, silhouetted against the stormy sky. From the outside, it looked like any other old, dilapidated building. But it was on the inside where the terror had unfolded. The victim was a known recluse, an elderly man named Harold Pennington, who lived alone. His housekeeper had discovered him in the morning, lifeless, face frozen in a terror that echoed through the grand, empty hallways. As I stepped over the threshold, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The mansion was a labyrinth of hallways, each one seemingly identical to the last. The dim light from the chandeliers painted the worn wallpaper in an eerie yellow light, casting long, disfigured shadows that twisted and curled along the floorboards. Harold's body lay in his study. I've seen my share of deaths, gruesome and otherwise, but something about Harold's was different. His eyes were wide open, pupils dilated, face white as a sheet, a sight that suggested a fear so intense it could stop one's heart. The coroner's report would later confirm it. He died of fright. But what could scare a man to death in his own home? As I delved further into the mansion, I discovered a small, hidden room behind a bookshelf in Harold's study. The room was dusty, suggesting it hadn't been accessed in years, possibly decades. The only object inside was an ornate mirror, its reflective surface obscured by the years of neglect. There was an eerie feeling in the air, an oppressive heaviness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I approached the mirror, wiping away the dust from its surface. I was met with my reflection, albeit slightly distorted by the age of the mirror. The face looking back at me was grim, my eyes reflecting the toll of years on the force. Then suddenly my reflection blinked. I froze, heart pounding as my reflection continued to move independently. It grinned at me, a horrifying, malicious grin that was never on my face. I stumbled backwards, the room spinning. Scrambling out of the room, I slammed the bookshelf closed, trying to regulate my breaths. I couldn't shake the image of my reflection, the malevolent look in its eyes. Whatever Harold saw, whatever scared him to death, I was starting to think I'd found it. As I navigated my way through the labyrinthine corridors, the mansion seemed to change around me. Corridors stretched on forever. Doors led to walls, staircases led to nowhere. The shadows twisted and danced, turning into grotesque figures that loomed in my peripheral vision. The mansion was alive, shifting and contorting itself into my worst fears. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, a rhythmic thud that synced with the throb in my temples. The fear was consuming, overwhelming. I realized I was living Harold's last moments. The fear, the disorientation, the dancing shadows. It was all too real. I stumbled, my legs giving away beneath me. The mansion was toying with me, turning my reality into a twisted nightmare. I closed my eyes, tried to steady my breaths. I was Detective James Hall, 15 years on the force. I'd seen crime scenes worse than this, had faced down criminals without blinking. I wouldn't let this house beat me. I wouldn't end up like Harold. With a deep breath, I pushed myself to my feet. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I found my way out of the mansion. The storm had passed, the sky a blanket of clear, cold stars. As I looked back at the mansion, I couldn't shake the feeling of countless eyes watching me from the dark windows. Back at the precinct, I reported my findings. The mansion was cordoned off and deemed unsafe, not just for its falling infrastructure, but for the inexplicable fear that seemed to permeate its walls. I could never prove it, but I knew the truth. I had walked out of that mansion a different man, a man who had stared into the face of true fear. And as I looked into the mirror in the precinct bathroom, washing away the sweat and grime of the day, I couldn't help but watch my reflection, waiting, wondering if it would blink first.
As a correctional officer, you deal with all sorts of dangers. The inmates can be unpredictable, and tension always seems to hang in the air. But what happened during my shift one night wasn't something any training could prepare me for. It was a maximum security prison, home to some of the most dangerous criminals in the state. That night I was in charge of Block C, known for housing the most violent of them all. The night started as any other. Lights out at 10 p.m., the heavy clang of metal doors echoing through the long, sterile hallway. As I was making the midnight rounds, I noticed something odd. Cell 113, home to an inmate named Jackson, was unusually quiet. Jackson was a big, burly guy with a twisted sense of humor. He'd often mutter or laugh to himself, so the silence was out of character. I peered through the cell door's small window, expecting to see him sleeping, but the cell was empty. This was impossible. All cells were locked and there hadn't been any alarms. I immediately radioed for backup. While waiting, I dared to open the cell. As the door creaked open, a strange smell wafted out, metallic and dank, a smell I couldn't quite place. I turned on the light, revealing the empty cell. Jackson's cot was untouched, his belongings in place. It was as if he had simply vanished. That's when I noticed it, the shadow. It was a corner of the cell where the light didn't reach, a darkness that seemed deeper and darker than it should have been. As I squinted to see better, the darkness seemed to shift, to sway. Before I knew it, a cold hand reached out from the shadows, grabbing my arm with a vice-like grip. I tried to pull away, but the grip only tightened. I looked up to see Jackson's face emerging from the darkness, his eyes filled with an indescribable fear. "I didn't mean to," he stuttered, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know it would follow me here." Before I could respond, he was yanked back into the shadow, his screams echoing in the tiny cell. The darkness shifted, roiled, and then nothing. The cell was quiet, the lingering echo of Jackson's screams the only evidence that anything had happened. Backup arrived moments later. I stumbled out of the cell, my mind reeling from what I'd just witnessed. An inspection of the cell revealed nothing. No sign of Jackson, no sign of a struggle, just an ordinary empty cell. I reported what I saw, but my story was met with disbelief. They searched the entire prison, but Jackson was nowhere to be found. His disappearance became another mystery, another ghost story in the prison's dark history. I still work at that prison, but I requested a transfer out of Block C. Some nights, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear the echoes of Jackson's screams. I can still feel the icy grip on my arm, see the fear in his eyes. That night taught me a chilling truth. Prisons are places of punishment, of retribution. But sometimes, the darkness within these walls isn't just the inmates or the crimes they've committed. Sometimes the darkness is far more literal, far more terrifying. A darkness that swallows you whole, a punishment far worse than any prison could inflict.
Night shifts on the desolate stretches of highway were never easy. The blackness of the sky overhead, the endless asphalt stretching out before me, and the heavy stillness that only seemed to be broken by the occasional roar of a passing truck. But as a highway patrol officer, it was my job, and I took pride in it. I was on Route 67, a long stretch of highway that wound through the desert, when I got the call. Dispatch reported a broken-down vehicle in the middle of nowhere, roughly a half hour from my position. I flipped on the sirens and sped off toward the reported location. As I approached, I saw the vehicle, a small sedan, stranded on the side of the road. Its emergency blinkers cast an eerie red glow in the otherwise pitch-black night. The car seemed to be abandoned, no sign of the driver anywhere. A chill ran down my spine. Something was off. After calling it in, I stepped out of my patrol car. The desert was eerily quiet, the only sound being the quiet hum of my vehicle and the distant howl of wind against the sand. As I approached the abandoned sedan, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. There was an unexpected coldness in the air around the car, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my bones. The car was empty, the keys still in the ignition. I called out for anyone nearby but received no response. Then it started. A low humming sound, like a radio dial turning, filled the air. The sound seemed to be coming from the car, but when I checked, the radio was off. The humming grew louder, vibrating through the still night air, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, I saw something in my peripheral vision, a dark figure standing several yards away on the road. As I turned to look, it disappeared. I was about to write it off as a trick of the light when I heard it, a whispering voice carried by the wind. It was distant, distorted but very much real. A sense of fear I'd never felt before washed over me. I returned to my patrol car, the whispers growing louder. I could now hear distinct words. "Leave. Danger. Run," it repeated, the urgency clear in its tone. Despite my fear, I remembered my duty. If there was a stranded motorist out there, I had to help. I took out my flashlight, my fingers trembling, and stepped back onto the road. I moved slowly, the beam of my flashlight dancing over the deserted highway and empty desert. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I continued my search, my every instinct screaming at me to get back into my car and drive. As I rounded the back of the sedan, a hand fell on my shoulder. I spun around, my heart pounding, only to find nothing. There was no one there, just the echo of a desperate plea in the wind, a chill in the air, and the lingering touch on my shoulder. I rushed back to my patrol car, the whispers returning, louder and more frantic than before. As I started the engine, I saw it again. The figure, now closer, its form more distinct in my headlights. But before I could react, it vanished, just as suddenly as it had appeared. I didn't stick around after that. I reported the car, requested a tow, and informed dispatch about the possible missing person. But I didn't mention the whispers, the figure, or the hand on my shoulder. Some things you just can't explain. That night shift on Route 67 still haunts me. I've been down that stretch of highway many times since then, and every time I can't help but feel a chill in the air, a hint of whispers in the wind. I wonder about the driver of the sedan, what happened to them, and what they might have experienced on that desolate highway. I learned something that night. Fear isn't always about what you can see. Sometimes it's about what you can't see, what you hear in the stillness of the night, what you feel when you're alone on a deserted highway. The unknown can be far more terrifying than any visible threat.
Being an FBI agent had always involved a mix of danger, excitement, and fear. I had dealt with serial killers, organized crime syndicates, and terrorism. Each case presented its own form of terror, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for what was known as the Midnight Call case. It began with a series of strange phone calls made to random households in a small town in Maine. Each call came precisely at midnight, the line hissing with static, then a low whisper repeating the same phrase. The door opens at dawn. By the time my team was called in, nearly every household had received the call. There were no leads, no traces, just fear gripping the town's inhabitants. The first night at the local field office, my partner, Agent Roberts, and I were going through reports when our office landline rang. Glancing at the clock, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was midnight. With a sense of foreboding, I picked up the phone. The line hissed, and then the whisper, "The door opens at dawn." The call ended abruptly, leaving a deafening silence. We traced the call, but it led nowhere. The source was untraceable, originating from different locations each time. We were dealing with someone highly skilled, someone who knew how to cover their tracks. As we delved deeper into the case, the atmosphere around us seemed to change. Shadows seemed darker, the nights colder. An uneasiness crept in, subtle but undeniable. On the third night, things took a turn for the horrific. The whispers on the phone changed. "The door has opened," it said, the whisper now laced with an otherworldly echo. That same night, the town woke up to a sight of pure terror. Each household that had received the call found their front door wide open at dawn, the insides of their homes trashed, belongings scattered everywhere. But nothing was stolen, no one was harmed. It was a display of power, of intrusion, a statement that they were not safe. Then they started to see it, a dark figure roaming the streets at night. It was always at the edge of their vision, a wisp of a figure flitting through the shadows. The figure would stand outside their homes, silent, watching. Each morning, the doors would be open, a silent testament to the night's terror. The town was on the brink of panic. We had to act fast. On the fourth night, Agent Roberts and I decided to stake out. Armed and alert, we waited in our car, parked inconspicuously near the town's residential area. Midnight came and went, the town bathed in an eerie silence. Then, we saw it, a figure cloaked in shadows at the end of the street. It moved from house to house, pausing at each door. With a sense of dread, I realized it was moving toward our location. As it drew closer, our car's electronics flickered. Our radio gave off a sharp static before a whisper broke through. "The door is open." The figure was now directly in front of our car. I could see no features, just an inky black silhouette. It was darkness personified, a void in the shape of a man. With a swift movement, it reached our car. I could feel a chill seeping in, a feeling of despair, of unspeakable terror. Then it moved past us, continuing down its path. We were found the next morning, unconscious in our car, the doors wide open. The figure was not seen again after that night. The calls stopped. Despite the numerous investigations and the manhunt that followed, we never identified the culprit. The case went cold, the terror it instilled lingering. The midnight call case was never solved. It remains a haunting memory, a reminder that there are things that go beyond our understanding, terrors that are not just in our minds, but lurk among us. As an FBI agent, I learned that it's not just the criminals that instill fear. Sometimes, it's the mysteries that remain unsolved that truly terrify us.
In my 10 years on the force, I'd seen a lot of things that turned the blood to ice. I had dealt with violent crime scenes, frantic 911 calls in the dead of night, and too many faces twisted by malice or fear. But the night of July 19th, that was something else entirely. It all started with a call about a disturbance at the old Fisher Hotel. It was one of those places that the city forgot about after the glitz and glamour faded into the past. A relic, complete with an eerie reputation, whispered stories of strange occurrences and guests that checked in but didn't check out. My partner, Evans, and I pulled up to the old hotel just past midnight. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie red glow onto the cracked pavement. The building itself loomed, a monolith of worn brick and darkened windows against the moonlit sky. The night clerk was a young woman who looked like she'd seen a ghost. She was jittery, her eyes wide and darting as she told us about the sounds coming from room 307. She said the guest had checked in earlier that evening and everything had seemed normal until the noises started. As we made our way to the third floor, the hotel felt more like a mausoleum than a place of rest. Each step on the rickety stairs echoed ominously in the silent hallway. When we reached room 307, we could hear it, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. I knocked on the door, announcing our presence, but the noise only grew louder. Evans and I exchanged a look before I kicked in the door. What we found inside was straight out of a nightmare. The room was in chaos. Furniture was overturned, and the walls were marked with deep scratches. But the guest was gone. There was no trace of them, except for their belongings scattered around the room. In the center of the room, there was a large, dark stain on the carpet that hadn't been there when the guest had checked in. It was black and seemed to seep into the very fibers of the carpet, a darkness that was almost palpable. And it was growing, spreading out from the center of the room like a shadow. As we stepped closer, I felt a cold wind sweeping through the room, despite the fact that the windows were closed. The stain seemed to ripple, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. When I turned, there was nothing there, just the lingering feeling of being watched. Then the voices started, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Indistinct at first, they gradually became louder, forming into a chorus of soft, urgent pleas. They were begging for help, for release, the voices of the missing guests. I radioed for backup, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to remain calm. The hotel was evacuated, the building cordoned off until we could understand what was happening. But deep down, I knew we'd never get the answers. Some things, some places, were just marked by something we couldn't understand. That night at the Fisher Hotel changed me. I still hear the whispers when it's quiet, feel the icy chill in otherwise warm rooms. It's a constant reminder that there are some cases we can't solve, some evils we can't fight. And still, every night when I patrol the darkened streets of the city, I can't help but glance at the old Fisher Hotel. The neon sign flickers, a sentinel in the darkness, a beacon of mysteries unsolved. I see the dark windows, and I wonder if those trapped within are still whispering, still waiting for someone to answer their calls.
Thank you for watching. If you like this content and would like more, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps bring more viewers like you.